So we have two presenters after morning tea, and the first one is Dr. Darryn Snell, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Management, and he's also a member of the Skills Training and Industry Research Group at RMIT University. Darryn's got extensive experience on employment and skills development questions and conducted a range of research in a variety of industries, including manufacturing, agri-foods, transport, logistics, clean tech and the electricity generation industry. And during the morning tea, Darryn and I had a quick chat and we realised that we both have a history in red meat, and so I'm expecting him to be up at our No Frills event in July next year, which is in Rockhampton. Nice, warm place, and in July next year, so we encourage everyone to come. Darryn has recently completed a major research project for the ARC, the Department of Regional Australia, Local Government, Arts and Sport, and the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, and the Gordon Institute. What he's talking about to us today is vulnerable workers and occupational mobility. And he's looking at transferable skills that are increasingly important for occupational mobility and securing employment in a turbulent environment and labour market that we've already spoken about this morning. Darryn's going to give us a précis on some qualitative case studies of company closures in various areas and look at how vulnerable workers and various key training and employment transition actors work to help these people adjust and assist them, understanding the importance of transferable skills and seek to apply these skills in finding new occupations for people. If you could make him very welcome to the podium, Darryn Snell.
Okay, let me set up here. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here. Victor Gaccaro, who's my colleague on this project, unfortunately couldn't be here. He wanted to be here, but he was rather short-noticed, invited by the Department of Education and Training for a workshop in Sydney looking at transnational skills standards in the maritime industry, where he has an expertise. So what I want to do today, and it follows on from a lot of the discussion that we've had so far, but very much looking at that question about transferable skills and what that actually means and how important are they and how do we know them, if you like. So I'll just talk a bit about the background of the study, debates about transferable skills, the ways in which we sought to, if you like, try and understand the ways in which transferable skills have or have not been embedded into our training system, and particularly qualifications. And then I'll talk about these case studies, with the aim being drawing upon the lessons that have come out of this research. What can we do to, if you like, do a better job in assisting workers in transition, retrenched, vulnerable workers, to understand their transferable skills and assist them in that occupational mobility challenges. So that's where I'll begin. But first, a message from my sponsor, if you like. This is part of an NCVER funded project looking at the question of cross-occupational skills transferability. And just a quick overview of that project, which is more or less wrapping up as we speak. There's a series of reports which NCVER will publish soon, which you'll be able to get hold of, which will draw upon the information I present here today. But it's basically consisted of three parts. And the first part was very much trying to understand where occupation's headed. So we're trying, in that first report or that first stage, very much looking at ABS data, trying to understand declining occupations and growing occupations, and what is the relationship, if anything, between the two. The second part, looking at, which I'll speak about here today, bits and pieces of, looking at the training system itself and the ways in which it is set up to deliver transferable skills, particularly in relation to qualifications and training packages. And then third were a series of case studies looking at that question of what actually happens in practice. So if I'm a worker who has been retrenched, in what ways do I understand my skills and the skill sets that I have? And Kay has spoken about that already. But also, what is the role of all those various actors I come in contact with who are supposed to assist me to get from here to here? What is their understanding of transferable skills, and in what way do they educate workers about those transferable skills? So that's the project in a nutshell. Of course, the background to this, and presumably the reason that NCVER has funded this project, is a consequence of what we're talking about here today, is significant industrial change, and associated with that significant occupational change. And I suppose what gets lost in all of the doom and gloom on the one side, which we've heard a fair bit about today, is that there is on the other side job growth. You know, jobs are being created, healthcare, community services, retail, hospitality, education, training, so on. These are often seen as not necessarily decent jobs, but there are a lot of jobs in that sector which are decent. Okay? And I suppose part of that is when we talk about job growth and job decline in industries, we often don't think about, well, what are the types of occupations that exist within those various industries? You know, aged care is growing, okay, fine, but what are the occupations within that industry? We need to go a bit deeper. Okay, transferable skills. You hear a lot about that at the moment and the importance about it. So I've just put this up here. You know, these are sort of news headlines. If you want to get a job, you need transferable skills. Transferable skills, the secrets of success. And you hear a lot of this, and we've heard a fair bit about it, the importance of that today as well. And for us, our starting point was, well, what are they? What are these so-called transferable skills? How do we know them? How are they different from other types of skills, and so on? Second question then, to what degree are these transferable skills being developed here in Australia through our training system? And third then, in practice, in what ways can we make better use of transferable skills to assisting in occupational mobility for disadvantaged or retrenched workers? So transferable skills. The problem with the notion of transferable skills is there's no international recognized taxonomy for what is a transferable skill. It's highly nebulous. And it's one of those concepts, a bit like globalization, I suppose, where we use it all the time, but we don't explain it. And so when we start to dig through some of the debates about transferable skills, you get stuff about, well, they're generic skills, they're non-technical skills, they're soft skills on one level. And then you get other debates, well, they're actually not skills at all. It's really about employee attributes or characteristics, their behaviors, their attitudes. That's what we're talking about. And so there's the purists, if you like, that want to hold on to there's a particular definition of skills, and then there's this other stuff which aren't skills. But increasingly, as we move to a service-based economy, that distinction between so-called technical and non-technical becomes much more difficult, and it was largely done in gendered terms in any case, as we've heard before. And so there's those that are saying, well, we need to take a more holistic approach which acknowledges that this relationship between skill and attitudes and employee attributes is increasingly becoming less clear, if you like. Now, when we started to enter this thinking about transferable skills in relation to the Australian training system, we looked at two dominant approaches, one coming out of the European Commission or the EU, which seeks to, and I'll put another slide up here in just a second, which seeks to create a taxonomy of soft skills, generic hard skills, and specific hard skills as a way to think about transferability. And at various levels, that approach has been adopted here in Australia, and I certainly know in Victoria there's some work that's been done around that. Another approach comes out of the United States related to what they call career clusters or occupational clusters, where there's greater sensitivity, if you like, to the particularities of families of occupations. And that when we talk about transferability, we need to put that transferability within a degree of occupational context. That you can have transferability within families of occupations, but not necessarily across very different types of occupational clusters, very different types of occupations. There, transferability becomes much more problematic, if you like. So the EU approach, as I said before, the idea here is that we can begin to, as we look at the various skills, knowledge, tasks associated with different types of occupations, we can begin to unravel those sort of soft skills, which includes those employee attributes, which are applicable across more or less all occupations. And we can say, well, okay, if those skills are developed in one occupation, then certainly they're going to be used in others. Generic hard skills become those technical skills which are used across a wide range of occupations, such as computer skills nowadays are seen as generic hard skills which we all need to develop. And according to recent reports in the paper, we're not doing a very good job of it with our children in the schools. Specific hard skills then become those which are highly specific to the occupation, and it's unlikely or difficult to use those skills in any other occupational context. So the career cluster approach, or the occupational cluster approach in the US, comes out of a long history of trying to map and understand relationships between occupations in terms of the skills, the knowledge that is required to fulfill occupations, which has a very long history in the United States, and identify where these similarities reside. And in relation to that now, there's an effort, and there's talk in this country about vocational streams, which is similar in many ways, that we create vocational pathways to create generic skills which will assist people with those skills into a range of those family of occupations. And here I think there is some utility of thinking about transferable skills, which is much more occupational contextualized when we start to dig into what's actually going on within the Australian vet system. So in the Australian vet system, we look at these two different approaches, and I think there's bits and pieces of both. I don't need to talk to this group about employability skills, but employability skills was very much about, you know, developing some level of transferable skill in our training system. Now, the question for us was, how transferable are these employability skills? Once you put it within various training packages and qualifications, we're seeking to develop skills for specific types of occupations, you then start to question that transferability. And what I've done is thrown up here just comparing the communication employability skill, which is supposed to be a transferable skill, in the Cert 3 warehousing operations versus the Cert 2 in hospitality, two very different types of occupations. Yes, both are developing communications, and there's no doubt that all occupations develop some level of communication skill set. But the question becomes to what degree that the ways in which one is trained to communicate and needs to communicate within these occupational contexts easily helps you then move into a different type of occupation. And I think in some regards that becomes the challenge when we talk about transferability skills as something which is truly universally transferable. And we have to be conscious of the ways in which even these employability skills have become embedded within qualifications and through an occupational lens. So the alternative approach which we looked at was looking at this sort of occupational cluster approach, and we did this through units of competency. And so here I think it becomes quite interesting where you can begin to identify where there is quite clear transferability at the level of competencies. Now, I know that's not the same as skills, but nonetheless. And so what I've done here, or what we've done here, is looked at Cert 3 in joinery. These are workers which are, at the moment, struggling with job opportunities. And if we map the core competencies, and this is just the core competencies, not the electives, that becomes a nightmare of a challenge. So we stuck with the core competencies, and we start to map what other occupations, or qualifications I should say, also use these same competencies. And on top of that then, we look at the ways in which those qualifications relate to those career clusters as developed in the United States. So what you see, of course, is overwhelmingly those competencies are shared across a wide number of other qualifications, but primarily within that same occupational cluster. So in a sense, not necessarily surprising. And you can also then begin to identify quite clearly what are the specific hard skills and what are the more generic hard skills being developed in terms of the sharing of those competencies. But what I think it does is it starts to open up opportunities of thinking about, well, where else are these skills being needed and being developed? Where else, both within the occupational clusters, but also outside those occupational clusters? And I think this can be used as a conversational piece with some of these retrenched workers who actually think that their skills are not needed anywhere else. They're so specific that they're not going to get them a job anywhere else, and they're doomed, and the sort of stuff that Kay was talking about, you just become very, very depressed. Here, you start to graph it, you start to see, okay, well, actually, I see there are a lot of occupations which are using some of those skills which I've learned. Cert 3 in timber composites, same sort of thing. This common one here, participate in environmentally sustainable work practices, a very generic hard skill, if you like, skills being developed in that unit of competency, and being used by a whole diverse range of other occupational clusters, from agriculture to government and public administration, hospitality and tourism. And so it does open up a conversation, I think, about levels of transferability and where these units of competency are utilized. So that's at the training system level, if you like. Now, when we moved to our case studies, and we looked at three. One, power generation in the Latrobe Valley, the Morwell Power Station owned by HRL, small power generator, which also produced or primarily produced briquettes. Energy was largely a byproduct, which closed recently, about a year ago, resulting in a very difficult situation in that coal community, brown coal generation industry, where, is it the first stage of a major closure, and what's going to happen with these sorts of workers? Case study 2, aluminium Alcoa in Geelong, which Kay also did some work. In case 3, the automobile industry, Ford in Geelong as well, which I won't spend a lot of time on because we've got the real expert down here with ASA in the room. Okay. Common perceptions of vulnerable workers. And I think Kay hit on this as well. Generally, the view is that I'm trapped. My skills are not going to assist me in finding another job. I'm going to have to completely retrain, or I have no hope of finding a job into the future. Because in many cases, retraining is not considered an option for some of these folks. It really is difficult for them to even think about going back to school, wanting to retrain, and I think Kay hit on that. Others are simply, when you raise the question of, transferable skills, which is a concept which is largely foreign, what does that mean? It's all, I'm not too sure. I've heard there's all these jobs in aged care. I don't think I have any skills that are going to assist me in that movement into that space. Right? Now, I'm a sociologist, so I like to study, you know, what happens in that social context. Who do these people come in contact? In what ways is their thinking, attitude, resilience shaped by all those various actors that they come in contact with through this retrenchment process, through the redundancy process? Kay talked about stages of pre and post training. We've presented it as redundancy announced, retrenchment, and then some sort of outcome, whether it's never to work again, retire, retrain, or find another job. And so when we look at these three case studies, there's levels of involvement of these various actors in each one of them. In the case of Energy Bricks in the Latrobe Valley, there was that information session where the various players were brought in to tell the workers about Centrelink, about job active agencies, about the TAFE, retraining opportunities, and so on. And that was about it. Right? There was a bit of RPL, which some of the workers took up. A lot were very hesitant because they thought, what's the point of getting accredited skills for which there is no future in that job? In the case of Alcoa, there was a fair bit of assistance, but over a pretty short period of time. So redundancy was announced, and there wasn't a long period at which they were then made redundant, but nonetheless, they were provided training support, career counseling, all the information sessions, and so on. So there was a fair level of support. The challenge there was it was pretty tight. It's a pretty short period of time. In the case of Ford, I like to refer to it as the Rolls-Royce model because the level of assistance that's provided there in terms of working with the workers, educating them about the diversity of their skills, not just their technical skills, but also these so-called transferable skills, the career counseling, the involvement with the various training providers and so on, is extensive and ongoing. Much more case management approach to it. I won't talk a lot about that because I think Vince is going to tell us what goes on at Ford. So what we see is workers receiving varying degrees of assistance from employment facilitators and training sector actors. What's the primary issue there? Well, money. And I think we've heard about the importance of, you know, if we're going to, we think these things need to happen. If we really think we want to transition workers, well, we do have to have the financial support to make that happen. The level of collaboration and cooperation, which I think is critically important, and Kay spoke about that as well, varied significantly. So these information sessions that happen at the time of announcement of redundancy, you got all the players in the room, and they all present all this information to the redundant workforce. Most of it, they're in a daze because they've been told they've lost their job, and it goes in one ear and out the other. But nonetheless, they're important. But there's a level of cooperation and everyone's around the table together. Then after that session, a lot of that cooperation tends to fall apart. Not in the case of Ford, but in many other cases it does. And then sort of vested interests start taking place. And retrenched workers start to find it all too difficult, and who they go see, and what are they telling me I should do, and what does this all mean? The issue of transferable skills, it was a mixed bag. Some saw retrenched workers having skills which weren't transferable, and they really did only think in terms of those technical skills of the manufacturing worker. And you got a lot of talk about they're institutionalized and so on. They've only known that same job over and over again. Others took a much more holistic approach to understanding skills and spent a lot of time thinking about the role of non-technical skills and worked to educate workers about the diversity of those skills. Strong emphasis on retraining. And I don't think, I know I'm almost there. Strong emphasis on retraining, but not often of the best advice, not often related to occupational job opportunities. Workers who were in particular occupations where there were mobility opportunities were in a very different space, obviously. So here's an example of a middle manager, if you like, being approached about, you know, please come to our firm, because he has a particular skill set which makes it relatively easy to move from industry to industry. Okay, this is my last slide, I promise. I think if we're going to talk about a framework, one of the things that I think we have to do a better job is understanding occupational labor markets, local occupational labor markets. And not just in terms of where the job's growing. You know, there's going to be 2,000 new jobs created in aged care. Okay, that's fine. Most of the jobs that are going to open up are going to be replacement jobs. And we don't talk about replacement jobs, particularly in the era of aging workforces. This is important. I think the stats are 80% of all jobs advertised are replacement jobs, not new jobs. And we don't do a good job on that front. Skills assessment, we need to know about the ways in which, if we do it a competency base or so on, the ways in which other occupations draw upon those skill sets. And I think we actually have the data to do a much better job in understanding those relationships. Clearly educating workers about their skills and where occupational mobility is viable can be informed by that sort of analysis using that occupational cluster framework or some abridged version of it in any case. And a coordinated and collaborative worker in transition program. And honestly, I cannot find a better example of it than what's taking place at Ford, and hopefully Vince will talk about that here in the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darryn. That was a really, really interesting talk, and we can see some common themes starting to come through from what our presenters are providing us with this morning. Again, we probably have time for probably 2 questions from the floor, if anyone would like to put their hand up or
Ron Wires, Master Builders Association of Victoria. Find this fascinating, particularly the last 2 presentations. Your comment on identifying local needs and industries is very valid. The construction industry is probably one of the largest employers of people nationally, particularly here in Victoria. And we have engaged with one of the automotive firms to look at ways that we can work together collaboratively to improve our industry. Our experience has been that the skill levels that are coming out of that manufacturing area probably exceed the skill levels in our own manufacturing sector. But we've had to do this off our own bat and alone. So I think we've probably jumped the official system and engaged directly. So just like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, well, don't know what I can say on that front, except that, I mean, I hear, just talking to people in the room, there is some quite interesting work going on with regards to trying to understand those relationships. I mean, there's a lot of concern about manufacturing workers and the importance of the skills that are there, but yet how and in what ways can those skills be, if you like, retrofitted into other types of occupations. And I think we have to develop better tools to go about doing that work. And I actually think we've got all the data, we're just not thinking about how can we use that data better. So in some senses, I think, let's stop collecting data. Let's start now thinking about the ways in which You know, all that data that's contained, and even if it's in through, you know, training.org, whatever it is that I spent so much time on, where you're looking at qualifications and units of competency, we can make use of that. And that's really where I think, you know, we can start to get our head around that much better. Now, there is the problem of a lot of those manufacturing workers don't have qualifications. But we know when we sit down where we could actually RPL them and get accreditation, so we actually know, in a sense, what sort of skills they have. Don't know if that's helpful. Yeah.
Okay, well, we might move on to our next presenter, and thank you so much, Darryn. It was really good.